Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Phillips, President of Americans for Prosperity. Thank you for joining us for another of our Facebook discussions with key leaders in Washington, D.C. As you know, we're working to stop this horrific, and I'm using quotation marks, this infrastructure boondoggle that Speaker Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and President Biden are trying to jam through Congress, $3.5 trillion of new spending. But frankly, maybe even worse than that are all the provisions of the Green New Deal, of this PRO Act, which is a big union power grab, and of Bernie Sanders' socialized medicine. They want to use this legislation to put in as many of the provisions as they can of these ideological wish lists, which is really what it is for the extreme left. We're joined by a rising leader in the Congress and a longtime friend, Congressman Gary Palmer from the great state of Alabama. Also by Josselin Castillo from our team at Americans for Prosperity in Washington, D.C. Congressman Palmer, I know that you and the House are facing a busy month ahead as you try to stop this legislation. Can you take, if you would, a couple of minutes to give us the aspects of this legislation that concern you the most before we get into maybe the mechanics of hopefully how we stop it?
Well, the thing that concerns me the most, Tim, and thank you for having me on, and Josselin, is that there's about $2 trillion sitting out there that has been appropriated over the last year and a half in COVID relief that hasn't been spent. Yet they want to put out another 1.2 trillion for an infrastructure package. And some of the packages are things that we need. We obviously need to repair bridges and roads and water systems. But what they're really trying to do is expand and implement this whole idea of the Green New Deal. And they're going to do it through infrastructure, under the guise of infrastructure. So you got $2 trillion out there that hasn't been spent yet. It could be repurposed for this. And I would say we don't need the total 1.2 trillion. That's because there's so much stuff in it that shouldn't even be in this package. And it's just going to continue to add to the debt. And I just want to point out to your listeners, and they probably already know this, but right now today we're somewhere around 102, 103% debt to GDP. That means that our debt is at least 2 to 3% bigger than our entire economy. If this goes through, and we add that 3.5 trillion that they're pushing, we're going to be somewhere in the range of 110% debt to GDP by the end of the year, meaning our debt will be 10% bigger than the entire economy. And we're trying to get some projections on what the interest payments will be on that, because we're talking about $68 trillion over the next 10 years. And they're still working on the numbers. That's how big this is. We're approaching a catastrophic level of debt that's going to put us, I think, in line with what's happening in other countries around the world that basically took modern economies and crushed them to the point that they literally have become almost third world countries. Yeah.
Josselin, go right ahead.
Congressman, I think you spoke about many things that our activists are very concerned about when it comes to the national debt, the deficits that we have been running, and particularly coming out of one of the worst economic and health crises. We should be doing things differently to try and jumpstart our economy. And so for those of us that are perhaps not following too closely, we know September is going to be a very busy month for you all. You sit in a committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, that will have a big chunk of one of these packages, the reconciliation partisan package, $3.4 trillion. That's a blueprint that's been engineered by Senator Bernie Sanders out of the Budget Committee in the Senate. So could you perhaps give us a sense for how, the infrastructure bipartisan package, $1.2 trillion, massive amounts of spending, paired with then this additional reconciliation package that will be being marked up here in a few weeks, how will those proposals actually impact everyday Americans when it comes to the prices that they're seeing day to day, through inflation, and how that will be exacerbated, as well as the potential taxes that will have to be raised in order to pay for this, massive amount of spending?
Well, first of all, on the healthcare side of things, on Medicare, and I know, Tim, you guys have a lot of senior citizens who support AFP. We're looking at having a deficit just on the Medicare side in the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund of $517 billion in 10 years by 2031. And we're not addressing that. And then when you talk about inflation, the single most inflationary component or commodity in our economy is energy. There's an energy cost in everything you've come in contact with today. From the time you got out of bed, made your breakfast, to getting ready for work, the clothes you put on, the transportation, whatever mode that was. I don't care if you rode a bicycle, there's an energy cost in it. And I point this out to people: the food you eat, somebody had to plant it, cultivate it, harvest it, refine it, package it, ship it. And when you start understanding how inflationary this is, most people are looking at the overall inflation numbers. It's about 6.4% thus far this year. It's the highest been in 3 decades. But look at the energy inflation. It's over 25%. And this is going to hammer low income people and elderly couples who are on fixed incomes. And it's going to show up in their food bills. It's going to show up in their utility bills. Literally, you're going to see people making decisions on how much they can afford to spend on their household utility bill, heating and cooling their home, and still have enough money to buy their food and medicine. That's what's coming down the pike. And I think that even some Democrats are starting to understand the inflationary nature of this. And when you run these massive deficits, that's going to have an inflationary impact because it increases the cost of capital. A lot of businesses are going to have to borrow money to continue to build their business or sustain their business, and those costs are going to go up. We have seen artificially low interest rates. It's the only thing that saved us thus far. But when you're starting to see the inflation that we're seeing right now, combined with the unbelievably stupid things that this administration is doing, that's only going to get worse. That's one of the reasons why the 3.5 trillion, to me, is one of the most disastrous packages ever brought before the Congress of the United States of America. Is that it sets in place some spending numbers that even if we get the majority back in the House and in the Senate next time, and we try to address this, you still got someone in the White House who will veto whatever we try to do. So we would be stuck with this for at least 3 more years. What we've got to do right now is pray that Kirsten Sinema, Senator Sinema from Arizona, Senator Manchin from West Virginia, will care more about the future of the country than they do about getting reelected. And frankly, I think if we continue to do the job we need to do, Tim, to educate people about this, I would think it would, the courage that they display in dealing with this would be a political plus for them rather than a negative.
Yeah, I agree with you, Congressman Palmer. Ladies and gentlemen watching, you heard Congressman Gary Palmer from Alabama and Josselin Castillo from AFP talking about this spending bill. Trillions of dollars of money and regulations for the Green New Deal. You heard Congressman Palmer talk about that. Make your voice heard. Click that I volunteer link. It's right there in the thread with this Facebook event. It'll take you about 1.5 minutes. It'll put you directly through to your House member and to your 2 United States senators. Let them know that in these next few crucial days, as they begin discussing and looking at this huge spending bill, that you want them to vote no on it. You may be thinking, well, gosh, I've got a couple of good conservative Republicans. They're going to vote no. They don't need to hear from me. In fact, it's good for them to know that people back home have their back, are encouraging them. And you may be in a district like Congressman Palmer just mentioned, or a state where you have a Joe Manchin, or perhaps a Democrat House member in a moderate swing district. I'm going to be in the Des Moines suburbs. That's Iowa 3, Representative Cindy Axne. You know, the folks in Des Moines, they're pretty conservative, you know, moderate conservative folks. They don't want this kind of, you know, Green New Deal and all this new spending. So we're urging folks like Congresswoman Axne to vote no on this. Make your voice heard. Click that I volunteer link. It'll take about a minute and a half of your time. It's fast, it's easy, but it's important. So I would urge you to do that. Get this, already since March 17, just over 1.6 million of your fellow Americans have clicked that I volunteer link, and they've made their voice heard against these infrastructure boondoggles. Join them. Be that 1.7 million maybe American doing that. Congressman Palmer, we're sitting here right on the cusp of a new month, September. Can you give us a sense, you're on a key committee, Energy and Commerce, that will be looking at some of this legislation. Do you have a sense of the timeline that we have over these next few weeks to try to stop this legislation? Has that come into view yet on what kind of time frame we're looking at?
Before I address that, you just mentioned Des Moines, Iowa. There's $66 billion in this for rails, but there's $91.2 billion in the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill for transit. And that's an enormous amount of money in and of itself, but there was already $70 billion in the COVID relief bills. So that's $161 billion just for transit. And I don't think people in Des Moines are all in on subways and metro lines. I joke
I think
that,
you're right.
well, I joke that the people who are for mass transit are for the people who are in the cars in front of them. We're a very mobile society. We're not going to give up our vehicles. But to go back to what the timeline might be on this is, I know that the Natural Resources Committee is met yesterday, and I think they're meeting today, marking this up. And it's about 32 billion of the total of the 3.5 trillion package. It's less than 1%. And they don't think that's enough, Tim. They're already trying to increase the funding for that, and it's all Green New Deal stuff. We're already seeing the impact in terms of inflation, as I pointed out, because of the energy policies of this administration. In that natural resources markup, I was talking to the ranking member, Congressman Bruce Westerman, who is one of the best of the best in the House. And apparently there's about 26 new revenue generators in that part that's under natural resources. And all of that will get passed on to the consumer. Yeah. And for people who think that, well, they're going to impose these costs on businesses, I've got news for you. There's no such thing as a business tax. There's no such thing as a business regulatory cost, because the consumer ultimately pays for it. And that's right. I think probably with ENC, I anticipate them calling us back early, but I haven't heard anything about what the timeline will be, but it will certainly be no later than that week of September 20th.
Congressman, you talk about the various effects that this would have, not only on our economy at the macro level, but also directly on families. The costs that will be passed down to consumers through inflationary spending, tax raises that, they say that it'll be kept to just the wealthiest. And we know that that's just not what projections show. Most Americans, middle class, will be hit with tax hikes, but there's also other aspects of this that I think could result in direct detriments to individuals. And one of those is, you mentioned Medicare earlier. I know that there are efforts to try to set price controls on prescription drugs in order to save money to pay for other partisan wish lists. And what CBO recently said, and what a lot of people have said, is that by imposing government price controls, on prescription drugs, you will actually limit the access that people have to life-saving treatments. So, as part of this massive bill, some of the things that are included in there will also give the government a little bit more control on things like prescription drugs, the expansion of a certain Medicare benefits. Could you talk to us perhaps about, what it is that should be concerning about prescription drug price legislation? And, I know your colleagues have alternatives out there that would actually lower out-of-pocket costs for individuals. We know that what's being proposed wouldn't actually help with out-of-pocket costs at the actual pharmacy counter. So what are these price controls, and why should it be concerning that it's part of this massive spending conversation?
Well, price controls are what you would have in Canada, what you would have in the United Kingdom. The British healthcare system, I think there's 25 cancer drugs for treating things like just basic cancers that we deal with here all the time that are not available there. They won't allow you to have access to them. And that's what's going to happen here. Out in Oregon, the Oregon healthcare system, there was a lady named Barbara Wagner, had cancer. She was able to get a drug that put her into remission. The cancer came back, and the Oregon healthcare plan wouldn't approve payment for the cancer drug. And it was several $1,000s a month that she couldn't afford, but they would pay for the drug that her physician could use to kill her, physician-assisted suicide. The drug company agreed to provide the drug for her for a year for free, but unfortunately she died a few months later. There was a lady, I think her name was Suzanne Packer, down in California, a mother of 4. I think the kids ranged from like 7 to 13. She was in her 30s, cancer. The California healthcare system wouldn't pay for her cancer drug, but they would pay for the suicide drug. And her copay would have only been $1.62 or $1.60, something like that. That's where we're heading with price controls. It will be destructive of innovation. I mean, there are literally life-saving drugs that will hit the market in the next few years that won't be there if they impose these price controls. And what people need to understand is that most of this research, a lot of this research is privately funded with an expectation of a return on investment. And it costs billions of dollars to get drugs to market. Not only the research to develop the drug, but to go through the approval process. We could reduce the cost of this if we could be a little bit smarter about how we expedite the approval process, but that's a different discussion for another time. But when you brought this up, and full disclosure, you didn't tell me we were going to talk about healthcare and the cost of healthcare. I just happen to have this little show and tell, Tim. I hope you pick it up.
No, go right ahead.
This is a report from the Fraser Institute in Canada, and it's the effect of wait times on mortality in Canada. Okay. In Canada, if you need an MRI, you might wait weeks to get it. Where if either one of us needed an MRI, we'd probably have it this afternoon or first thing in the morning. But that's not the case there. The average wait time in metropolitan Canada is like 18 weeks. And in rural Canada, it can be up to 30 weeks. And what this study found was that between 1996 and 1994 and 2009, they estimate that somewhere between 25,000 and 63,000 Canadian women died waiting for treatment. That's what you get with price controls. That's what you get with government-run healthcare. And I encourage you guys, if you want the link, I'll send it to you. But you ought to take a look at this study. I see the cover of the study. That's where we're heading. And here, you have people here who can get treated for prostate cancer with a cancer drug that we just take for granted here that they can't get in the United Kingdom. think it's 46% of the physician referrals for a joint replacement, like a knee replacement, are declined by the British healthcare system. And think about that. That's physician referred procedures that get declined, and it's all because of the cost. Them trying to hold down the cost.
You know, when the extreme left talks about national health care, what they mean really is national health insurance. So everyone gets to have an insurance card from the government. The problem is they can't actually get any care. And you just pointed that out with the study from Canada, which we have seen over and over and over happen along our northern border as Canadians come across to a robust, medical clinic industry along that border that's on our side of it, because Canadians can't get actual care on their side too often in a timely manner. And that is such a great point. Well, we've got a big next 3 to 4 weeks left on this infrastructure bill. Congressman Palmer, I know I've known you for a long time. We face big challenges as a country. We've talked about some of them today. I know at Americans for Prosperity, we're working to stop this legislation. I would just one more time urge folks to click that I volunteer link. It's important. Make your voice heard on the Green New Deal, on the provisions of Bernie Sanders of really socialized medicine is really what it is, government control from the top down. Make your voice heard on this now to your members. But in the face of these threats, Congressman Palmer, I know you well. I also know you're an optimistic person. You have an enormous optimism about our country. Wrap us up today, telling us why you still have an optimism and a sense of hope, despite the current challenges we're having coming out of Washington, D.C.
Well, Tim and Josselin, we're an amazingly resilient people, and we've been in some really tough times before in this country. And Winston Churchill famously said that America will always do the right thing after they've exhausted all other options. And I feel like we're at that point right now, but prior to COVID, I would take people on nighttime tours of the Capitol, and I love taking young people, particularly high school seniors and college students. And one of my favorite places to take them is into the Rotunda. That's one of the most beautiful architecturally places in the world. But I like to take them over to the statue of Ronald Reagan. And I'll gather them around that statue, and I'll tell them, we're in a really tough time right now in this country, but we were in a really tough time in 1979. And Josselin probably doesn't remember that, but Tim, I know you do.
That's right.
It was a time when we had double-digit unemployment, double-digit inflation. Consumer interest was double-digit, hit 21% in the spring of 1980. The Soviet Union was in Central America. They were in the Caribbean. They were in Central Africa. They invaded Afghanistan at the end of that year. We had an energy crisis. We had gas lines. Our military was in shambles. We had 52 Americans being held hostage in their embassy in Tehran. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? And a lot of people, conservative and liberal alike, believed that the Soviets were going to win the Cold War. And it looked like we were in a free fall in terms of national decline. But I remind people that that's not all that was happening in 1979. In May of 79, a lady named Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister of Great Britain. And I point to the statue of Reagan, and I point out that that gentleman was running for president, talking about how he's going to rebuild the American economy, and that he was going to literally put the Soviet Union on the ash heap of history. But there was another guy, a third guy, named Pope John Paul II, who was born and raised in Poland, announced that he was going to return to Poland. And he went back in June of 1979. And the KGB, the Soviet secret police, initially planned to have him assassinated. But instead, they pumped atheism into the Polish school system for weeks ahead of his visit. And they attempted to muzzle the Polish media to limit the number of people who know that he was coming. But guys, when the motorcade took him from the airport at Warsaw into the old city of Warsaw, there were 1 million people lining the streets chanting, "We want God." And I tell those young folks, I tell everybody this, the light will always penetrate the darkness. That's what AFP is about. That's what a lot of these state and national organizations are trying to do, is shine a light on this stuff. A few days later, he held a mass outside the city of Krakow in a place called Blani Field. And they estimate that between 2.5 and 3 million people gathered in that muddy field to hear that homily. And at one point in it, he begged them not to forget their spiritual heritage, which he said went by the name of Poland. You could say the same thing about us. And at the end of it, he said it. He encouraged them. He said, "Do not despair. Do not be discouraged. Do not be defeated." When he died, Peggy Noonan wrote a beautiful eulogy. It was in the Wall Street Journal. And she said it was at that point that most historians believe that the fall of the Soviet Union became inevitable. But the point I want to make is that almost 8 years to the day later, I think it was June 10th, 1987. I think the homily was June 8th, 1979. Almost 8 years to the day later, Ronald Reagan stood outside the Brandenburg Gate and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And 17 months later, it was down. Now, here's my point. We're at a really tough place right now. But the whole world was changing in 1979. Most people missed it. Tim, if either one of us had gone anywhere in the country and said in 10 years, the United States will have gone through the greatest economic expansion the world's ever seen, and the Iron Curtain would be down, people would have thought we were crazy. But the whole world was changing. And it's changing now. And people need to get involved. And I tell people right now that your names may not be written in the pages of history, but what you decide to do for your country right now will be reflected in those pages. You need to get involved. Reagan's last speech was in 1992 at the Republican National Convention in Houston, Texas. And he quoted a guy named James Allen, who had written in his diary that most thinking people believe America's seen her best days. He wrote that July 26, 1775. The whole world was changing, Mr. Allen missed it. So what I would say to the supporters and followers of Americans for Prosperity, the whole world is changing. Don't miss it. Get involved, be a part of it. You can make a difference. The country's at stake, and we don't have much choice. But believe me, we're resilient people, and we can turn this around.
Congressman Gary Palmer, well said, from the state of Alabama. Well said. What a great way to wrap up this Facebook conversation with you across this country. For Josselin Castillo at AFP, Americans for Prosperity, I'm Tim Phillips. Thank you for joining us.